subject of the talk of Christian Langer is the reception of Roman Egypt by Europeans. First, he would like to address the construction of Egypt as part of the West before discussing some case studies from pop culture and neoclassicist representative architecture, and ultimately summarizing the key findings to conclude this presentation. Egyptology has been an academic field mainly dominated by Europe since its inception at the turn of the 19th century. Its genesis is in the wake of the French invasion of Egypt in 1798, marked the beginning of what could be called the militarization of archaeological and anthropological knowledge by European powers in order to influence and control the populations of the Middle East. The creation of Egyptology was a continuation of European policies of submission that began with the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and were subsequently exported throughout the globe, albeit in a form accommodating local or regional features. Ancient Egypt, with its ties to the Bible and connection to the Greek and Roman world, was constructed as a precursor to Western civilization, as well as its natural appendix, given that it had been ruled by Greeks and Romans, Byzantines, for roughly a millennium until the Arab conquest. As one of many effects, European audiences have widely received ancient Egypt and its cultural heritage, with Egyptomania presenting only one facet. The public sphere may perceive Egypt as a rather monolithic civilization, mainly to be associated with pharaonic glories, and as the traditional research fallacy of Egyptology also suggests. That poses the question to what extent the Roman domination of Egypt is a factor in the reception of ancient Egypt. So far, studies have usually dealt with ancient Egypt, Egyptian history in general, which resulted in an emphasized visibility of pharaonic Egypt in European Egyptomania, and the wider reception, thus likely contributing to the enhanced perception of Egypt as monolithic. It is easy to imagine that when first thinking of how an Egypt connected to Rome features in modern Western pop culture, one is likely to come up with the triangle of Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony is immortalized by the classic Cleopatra movie. A more recent adaptation of that story is part of the HBO miniseries Rome that was produced between 2005 and 07. A couple of episodes deal with the Cleopatra-Caesar Mark Antony story arc, with the Battle of Actium and the subsequent double suicide of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, providing the climax of season 2 and the entire series. It is noteworthy that, according to Rome's creator, Bruno Keller, the entire series was supposed to go over 5 seasons, with the storyline of season 2 stretching from season 2 to 4. Due to the cancellation of the series, the content of 3 seasons was crammed into a single season. Season 5 would have dealt with the rise of Jesus in Palestine and the Roman administration of the situation, and thus disregard Egypt as a setting for the storyline. What can be observed is that actually Roman-dominated Egypt seems to be absent either as a setting or any other device connected to the storylines. It seems that somehow the incorporation of Egypt into the Roman Empire following the Cleopatra Mark Antony storyline deprived it of its Egyptianness or exoticism, that it became part of Europe in the sense of an imagined Western civilization, with Rome as one of its high points. Major pictures dealing with the Roman domination of parts of the Middle East usually deal with the life of Jesus Christ in Palestine, as described in the New Testament. Hence, the reception of Roman Egypt is rather marked by its absence from Western pop culture. Representative architecture could show if anything related to the Roman domination of Egypt has been adopted or adapted by Europeans at all. Obelisks are the prime example that is not obelisks as structures, but rather the very idea and practice of placing them anywhere outside Egypt as a symbol of imperial power, as was already noted by Fakhri Hassan in this context. The practice of removing obelisks from Egypt and setting them up in Rome began under Augustus and continued until late antiquity, before it became resurgent during the Renaissance. Beyond re-erecting Egyptian originals, Europeans also adapted obelisks as part of their own classicist repertoire. One example is Italy's fascist leader Benito Mussolini's obelisk in Rome. Yet, the best example for the appropriation of obelisks as symbols of power is probably the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. At roughly 169 meters in height, it is the world's tallest obelisk. It is located in the ideological center of what is today the only global empire. Well, that was mine. I want to steer attention to a case study that has not garnered any attention so far. Obelisks are as an element of Nazi architecture that were intended as part of the Berlin airport and the extended north or south axis in Adolf Hitler's plan for redeveloping Berlin. The architect, Ernst Zagebiel, was tasked with the construction of the world's largest airport between the mid-30s and early 40s, fit to underline the aspirations of the National Socialist state. Since at least late 1938, his plans included two obelisks that were to be erected at the opposite end of the square and form a line of sight from the airport terminal to the memorial in the Victoria Park on the hill opposite the terminal. The obelisks were never built due to the progress of the Second World War. However, the fact that obelisks formed a part of the architectural repertoire is intriguing. Interestingly, none of the researchers apparently seem to have found them peculiar, even though Nazi obelisks never were built. Yet the plans show that they existed in the minds of architects tasked with building Hitler's world capital. Alas, the reason for placing obelisks associated with the airport is inconclusive. A survey of Zagebiel's biography did not reveal any clues as to why he chose obelisks as part of the architectural arrangement at all. Given his preference for neoclassicist architecture, however, it seems highly probable that he thought of them as an element of classicist architecture. The placement of a pair of obelisks may reflect an Egyptian practice. Possibly aware of the cultic function of obelisks, the Berlin pair may have filled a similar role due to its association with the monument in the Victoria Park commemorating the Prussian victory over Napoleonic France. The two obelisks may have flanked some kind of cult axis between the monument and the main hall of the airport. However, the two obelisks might have been scrapped by mid-1941, and the model of the north-south axis from July 41 indicates. The forecourt in front of the airport no longer shows the obelisks. Alas, it is perhaps impossible to ascertain whether Zagebiel had abandoned his plans from 2 years earlier, or whether part of his structures did not feature in this model of Germania, since Albert Speer was tasked with its construction. In any event, the actual background seems unlikely to be recovered. Another thing, just north of the Great Wall, we can recognize a rectangular water basin with two thin, tall columns at its northern end. So it's at the top of the picture, at the top of the slide. The model of Germania, created for the movie Downfall, made in 2004, reveals that these columns appeared to be obelisks as well, albeit somewhat different style from the obelisks in Tempelhof. Interestingly, neither primary nor secondary sources seem to mention these structures, although they were indeed part of the blueprint for the representative core of the Nazi Empire. A couple of studies describe the Great Hall and its surroundings in detail without mentioning the obelisks. Likewise, Albert Speer's autobiography does not mention them in otherwise highly detailed descriptions of the whole arrangement. Thus, the reasons for their inclusion have to remain speculative. Interestingly, the overall arrangement may have reflected Washington, D.C., in the sense that it was a much larger version of the Capitol, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument. In the film model of Downfall reflects the original dimensions, then the obelisks would have been about as tall as the Great Hall, i.e. 320 meters, about twice as tall as the Washington Monument. Other pictures of the original model suggest that they were rather half as tall as the Great Hall, roughly the same size as the counterpart in Washington. Thus, the Nazis had at least planned to erect two Washington monuments, possibly even two of twice the size. Another, yet again architectural example, points to Egyptian architecture as inspiration of Nazi architecture. The planned avenue leading from the southern train station to the Triumphal Arch as part of the north-south axis. As Albert Speer recalled in his autobiography, the station plots are 3,300 feet long and 1,000 feet wide, was to be lined with captured weapons after the fashion of the Avenue of Rams, which leads from Karnak to Luxor. Hitler conceived this detail after the campaign in France and came back to it again in the late autumn of 1941 after his first defeat in the Soviet Union. Quotation ended. The faint but observable influence of Egypt on Nazi architecture points to another issue. While recent research on German Egyptologists during Nazi rule has shed some light on research agendas between 1933 and 1945, it remains unclear to what extent the Nazi leadership was informed by ancient Egypt. Whereas the role in Nazi ideology of German prehistory, the Middle Ages, and classical antiquity has been well understood, the same cannot be said of ancient Egyptian or the ancient Near East. To find traces of the latter two, one may have to look more closely into source material, as it may be a lot less visible and obvious than these examples. Its architecture, however, reveals the Roman focus on the Nazi leadership. Nazi architecture was not only to rival but to surpass Roman architecture to showcase Germany's greatness, an agenda that may reflect Hitler's personal admiration for the Roman Empire as the pinnacle of Western civilization. It appears likely that Hitler and other leading Nazis engaged in cultural diffusionism by regarding the Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans as similar, if not essentially the same. For instance, Hitler proclaimed that the New Berlin would be comparable only to ancient Egypt, Babylon, or Rome. What will London and Paris be in comparison? Hence, it seems likely that the Nazis diffused several civilizations into one culture and connected them with Western greatness, which reflects European colonial thought since the early modern period, as noted earlier. It appears probable that obelisks were rather seen as part of the classicist repertoire, thus unaware of the earlier Roman appropriation of the Egyptian structure, regarding it as part of classical antiquity and Western civilization. And finally, a survey to Western pop culture revealed that Roman Egypt does not appear to play a major role in popular imagination of ancient Egypt and their consumption. Roman-dominated seems to be perceived as deprived of its Egyptian essence. Hence, Roman-Egyptian interconnections have not featured in major productions beyond the Cleopatra-Caesar, Mark Antony triangle. Direct influences of Roman Egypt, in all likelihood, do not exist in neoclassicist representative architecture. The case study of obelisks revealed that modern appropriations of these structures as symbols of imperial power go back to the early days of the Roman Empire, when Egypt had just been incorporated into the empire. The Nazi case suggests that through an act of cultural diffusionism, obelisks were perceived as part of the classicist repertoire. That indicates that Europeans, since the early modern period, reproduced a much older Roman appropriation of Egyptian culture, fitting into a colonial narrative of cultural superiority of the West. For future research, a comparative study of the appropriation of obelisks may produce insights whether there have been different narratives and imaginaries attached to them. Related to the appropriation of obelisks as the emulation of a Roman idea, the same could be argued about pyramids. That also raises the question of to what extent the adoption of Egyptian cults like that of Isis by Rome is the origin of Egypt's association with mystery and exoticism that would later on become so visible in Western pop culture. In a way, the scientific exploration of ancient Egypt as well as Egyptomania may therefore be a side effect of the very same Roman mechanism turned a Western mechanism. Pop culture, as well as research on that pop culture, may thus help us in reproducing that mechanism. In any case, the findings of this paper suggest that Roman Egypt has been received by Europeans in a more indirect ideological way without necessarily being aware of that. Beyond the initial research question, expounding the outlook beyond the confines of Europe as perceived by Europeans, and ideally including the global South in ascertaining how and why Rome as such has been the object of popular reception may address the question why and to whom Rome is important in creating a cultural or even political identity, and whether that is actually a sensible thing or not. I hope I conveyed the meaning of the paper. Thank you.